Thanks so much, and it's great to be with all of you today. If I seem a little bit happy, we had a small Supreme Court decision today that had a lot to do with the FDA and a lot to do with the health of Americans' families, so I am very happy. Congratulations on this meeting. All of society is seeing the promise of AI, and it's no less the case for the 20% of the economy that's regulated by the FDA. There's some parts of it that when I talk to people, they don't normally think about. We not only regulate drugs and devices, which is a big part of the discussion today, we also regulate food. And if you think about the interdigitated global supply chain for food and the opportunities of genetic editing and all the interconnections that could make a difference for the health of people. And then cosmetics. I never really thought much about cosmetics, but the plenary session at the big cosmetics meeting this year was on the use of generative AI so that you can talk to the computer about what types of cosmetics you'd like and see what you're going to look like based on generative AI. And of course, we also have the Center for Veterinary Medicine and the application of the tools of AI to the 3,000 species of animals around the world also holds a lot of promise. So I would guess that everyone in this room gets a promise related to things that are going to be talked about next when it comes to discovering targets and new drugs at a fairly rapid rate compared to the past, developing products much more quickly using AI to simulate and get it right in development, and even discussion of complete trial simulation. And when we think about it at the FDA, it's not only, and God forbid I should talk about this, but it's not just regulating the outside world. I think there's a really big question for federal agencies about how to use AI internally. I'm a clinician by trade, and everything that's said about doctors in a clinic or nurses in a clinic recording data and clicking boxes could be transformative in the same way for FDA reviewers and the work that we have to do trying to regulate over 1 million establishments with 1,400 inspectors and a few thousand additional employees. And then just a quick few notes of caution. People who know me know I'm kind of a curmudgeon about things. I guess it goes with the job. First, the talk about replacing clinical trials. I think the beauty of everything that happens before the phase 3 clinical trial for the FDA is that it's open game. I'm not really worried about what happens in drug molecule development, all that. Ultimately, you've got to show that your drug or device has benefits that outweigh the risks in the intact human being and a live human population. So that's the test that needs to be met. What happens before that, I think, is a very open area for discovery. I'm also very worried about decision support. And just a quick note here before my last point. As I'm talking to people in health systems in the U.S., I'm finding the criteria for adopting AI as a financial criteria. And unfortunately, optimizing finances in our health system right now and better patient outcome are not well aligned. Just look at where the money is being spent in our medical centers, then look at what Americans are dying of. We're currently almost in last place now among high-income countries in health outcomes. And so I'm desperately hoping that as we continue to lead the world in technology, we figure out how to take the technology and not just apply it to the wealthy, but apply it to people who really need it. And this gets me to the quote that I feel is very appropriate for today that I use a lot from Ed Young in The Atlantic. It was about the pandemic, but I think it's very applicable here. And the quote is that technological solutions drift into society's penthouses. Diseases seep into society's cracks. And in the 5 years I spent at Alphabet, I definitely saw this. No matter how hard we tried, the hot technologies get taken up by people like us in this room, and most Americans are being left behind in this effort. So I now want to introduce, not to put any pressure on Wade Shen, the Director of Proactive Health, but I want to introduce him because I think he has some great ideas as we think about the technology and then also how to be proactive, not just for individuals who are in the know, but for the populations who are falling behind in our country. Thanks, and I'll now make way for Wade.
Apparently I'm Rob Califf. Did he say nice things about me, by the way? I couldn't hear him back there. Hopefully it was all good. Oh, I tap something. That's what happens here. Oh, and then I tap it again. There we go. That's me. Okay, so here we go. As somebody who's been working on AI for a long time, in all seriousness, I think that the promise of being able to use AI to accelerate the development of new therapies is one of the most foundational things that we can do as a society to make use of this technology that's just emerging now. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that. But before I get into that, I think it's important for you to understand that we need new therapies. We need better medicines. We need new medicines. And the reason we need new medicines is that we only have treatments for a very small fraction of all of the known diseases that are out there. 8,000 plus diseases have no known treatments associated with them. Each year, we develop on the order of 37 to 40 new drugs. And most of those drugs are actually for things that we already know how to treat. And only about half of them are for treatments that for conditions that we didn't know how to treat before. And the illnesses that we don't know how to treat, they affect tens of millions of people. There are diseases like dementia that can rob people of their lives, but they can also just rob people of the quality of their lives for multiple decades going forward. People can develop dementia in their 40s and their 30s. They can live with it for 30 to 40 to 50 years. And the effects of these diseases not only extend to the victims of the diseases themselves, but also to the people who care for those people who have the disease. And sometimes those effects are also many, many decades long, and also tend to not just affect the direct person, but all of the people around them. When we think about why it is that we only develop 40 drugs a year, it's important for us to understand the process by which we develop these drugs and in which we develop these treatments. The process is really, really hard, okay? Every drug that we need to develop often takes decades to reach a successful point, and often costs many billions of dollars in order to be able to develop. And that's because a whole bunch of drug candidates fail along the way. Sometimes we don't even know necessarily the right things to go after when we're designing drugs in the first place. And then ultimately, if we do find something that we can target, it doesn't mean that it's safe, and it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be effective in human beings. And so we have to go through all sorts of rigorous testing in order to figure out whether or not it's going to be safe, it's going to be effective, and that whole process can take a very long period of time and is very, very error-prone. It's a very scientific process, but unfortunately it's also a very error-prone process. And so it's costly, and there's a lot of failure associated with it. And yet we still manage to do something, and that's really great. But there's new promise and new opportunity coming to us from AI. As you all know, because I'm sure you have seen publicly, like every story that comes out in the news these days, AI has remarkably been able to do interesting things, and most of what you have seen publicly is associated with the development of AI that models language, human language. That's because we have a lot of data associated with human language, and we've learned over time how to make use of that data in order to train these models in understanding of human language. Well, at the same time that people have been working on the modeling of human language, there have been people that have been working at the intersection of biology and chemistry and AI who have been using the same kinds of technologies to model biological and chemical language. And that language has resulted in interesting, new, and promising capabilities, especially when we couple it with the right kind of data. Now, these are typically data that are associated with biological and chemical experiments that tell us something about the properties of chemicals. So it's not just enough to know something about the language. You have to know what that language means, right? And so figuring out what that language means understanding the structure of different sequences of chemicals or different sequences of nucleic acids. and the function of those sequences. And if you can start to model that, which people have now started to show is potentially possible, you can make interesting models that are potentially predictive of those properties. Now, the data that we have for doing this, like I said, comes from various sources, but a lot of it comes from biological and chemical experiments. But that kind of data is limited in scale, and so people have started thinking about how they can use AI systems to derive properties of chemicals for unseen chemicals. And they've also started using AI systems to drive automated experimentation, which creates more data for us to use. And of course, we have all of this clinical data that's available to us from years of treating patients with various drugs and various chemicals. And when we do that, we start to understand the properties of chemicals in terms of how they behave with biology. Well, that's all great. The problem is, though, that ultimately these kinds of data are very limited in terms of scale. Okay? And there are a number of reasons for this. One is that clinical data is actually really hard to aggregate and to turn into something that is meaningfully usable for the purposes of drug development. And that has to do a lot with how our medical record systems work and what it means to piece together a story about patients in terms of their data. On top of that, there's a lot of additional biochemical experimentation data, and it comes from the failures of drug development. So I showed you that most candidates don't actually succeed in terms of the development process, and that means that we've actually got a lot of characterization of various drugs that have failed but have never quite managed to make it to the marketplace. And that's a huge repository of data that sits in a number of corporate silos that make it extremely hard for AI developers to make use of, largely because these data are typically protected by IP. Now, on net, when you put all of that together, the data that we have in biology and chemistry that's really accessible to us to build models is fundamentally many orders of magnitude smaller than the kind of data that we put together in order to be able to build large language models. And that's really a fundamental problem, right? We are not fully making use of the kind of technology that we have in the same way that we build chatbots for doing something like building life-saving therapies. That seems fundamentally wrong. Like, what can we do about that? Well, first of all, before we get into what we can do about that, I think it's important to know what we could get out of it if we could do something about that. And so when we look at the drug development process from end to end, there are many ways in which having models of the right kind and of the right power could potentially improve outcomes for the process and make it much more efficient. The first of which is that we could potentially think about using AI models to start predicting better targets that we could go after biologically, and to start to design and optimize candidates in such a way that more candidates succeed in the process, and we're able to develop leading candidates in a much faster way. If we could do that, we could potentially take many years of development and many failures off the table and turn this process into one that only lasts months, if not hours or days. Now, in addition to that, the fact is that a lot of testing has to be done even when you have something that's a potentially viable candidate, and oftentimes that early testing happens in models. They're just not AI models currently. They're models that we build of biology in test tubes and in animals, in mice, for instance, in larger animals. And then ultimately, if we can test successfully the safety of drugs in those models, we can start to think about testing in human beings. That's part of the process by which we currently conduct phase 1 clinical trials, for instance. But that process is also very long, right? That takes multiple years and is extremely expensive to conduct. And so what if we were able to build AI models that could predict the outcomes of these kinds of safety trials and these kinds of early clinical trials? Well, if we could do that, we could potentially collapse many years of early safety testing down into something that is potentially only months away from us. And then finally, if we're able to build models that could potentially tell us whether or not drugs are going to work in human biology and be effective, then we could really shorten the time it takes to conduct clinical trials. So every time you hear about a new drug that was announced at a medical conference and then you don't see it for like 15 years, well, the reason that happens is that it takes a very long time to conduct the clinical trials to validate that it's going to actually work in reality, right? What if we could press a button and get that kind of information out very quickly? Or what if we could shorten the time it takes to do that because we can figure out the right population to test on so that we can understand whether or not a drug is going to work properly? That's the kind of thing that AI could potentially help us to do. If we're able to put all of these things together, we might be able to get to a future where we can have new therapies in months and not decades. So that's the goal, okay? Now, I just said something that's pretty easy, and you saw like a bunch of PowerPoint that made it look like it was going to happen really quickly. So it's going to happen, right? Yeah, yes, it is. But it's going to be really hard to do that. And it's going to take a lot of things actually happening in order for us to effectively do that, not the least of which is a huge investment in doing this kind of thing at a national scale. And what I mean by that is, first and foremost, we need to figure out some really hard problems. How do we get all of the data that we already have together in such a way that we can use it for AI? Okay, I said that clinical data exists in a bunch of places. Drug discovery data exists in a bunch of places. It's bound by all sorts of legal restrictions that prevent us from getting access to it. It's bound by privacy. It sits in hundreds of companies, in research institutions, in care providers, in drug companies. How are we going to get all of that together in such a way that it's going to be effective for AI use? Well, it's going to take technology, okay, because the technologies that we have to interoperate that data don't exist today in exactly the form that we need it to. It's going to take legal agreements and licensing frameworks and all of the things that it's going to make possible for us to be able to share that data and to allow people to protect the IP that is associated with that data. And at the end of the day, that may in and of itself not be successful in terms of creating the scale of data, because the scale of data that we need may be much larger than what's available today. And so we're going to have to figure out how to create more data. That's going to involve a national investment in the kind of data that's necessary to make AI possible. And then finally, when we put all of that together, data is the ingredient that drives a lot of these systems. But you have to build the systems, and you have to prove that these systems can work. If we are able to do that as a society, then we also have to figure out how to make use of these systems in our regulatory processes. And we all know that our regulatory processes have to figure out how to trust these systems, and our systems have to engender trust for the regulatory system to actually make use of that. That involves government and industry and everybody else in this field working together to make an effective capability that is also deployed in the world. Now, if we're able to do that, I think we could potentially live in a world where people who suffer from disease and their caregivers have access to effective treatments. Right now, that's many, many hundreds of millions of Americans who do not. Let's make that world possible. Thank you.